As I have occasion to do from time to time, I'd like to begin this morning by asking you a question. But let me warn you, this is a rather easy question I have today. And that question is, when were you born? Now, my guess is that the vast majority of you would answer that question simply with a date, that being, of course, your birthday. But a few of you, depending on when you were born, might answer in a different way. And that is by saying that you were born the same year as some important event. For example, that you were born the very year that World War II began, or perhaps the year it ended. Or maybe you were born the same year that human beings first walked on the moon, or something else along those lines. And my question for you is, how is that different from simply giving me a date? Well, I think it is different. Actually, I think it's very different. And I want to illustrate how and why by giving you an example from my own life. My father went to work for the federal government on March the 4th, 1933. A fact that in all likelihood means absolutely nothing at all to you, except perhaps to wonder why on earth I would remember something as obscure as that. Well, the fact is, I don't remember it. I have to look that date up every time I tell the story, which is not very often. But my father never really said he went to work for the government on March the 4th, 1933. That's not what he said. What he always said is that he went to work for the federal government on the same day as another fellow did, and that together, he and this other fellow pulled this country out of the depths of the Great Depression. That other fellow, of course, being Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was in fact inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on March the 4th, 1933. And while there's no trace, even on the internet, of just exactly when it was that my father went to work for the Corps of Engineers, it's very easy to look up the date of Roosevelt's first inauguration. He was, by the way, the last president of the United States to be inaugurated on March the 4th, since with the adoption of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, that date was changed to the current January the 20th. As in this case, or any other, there are these two basic ways of our dating an event. One is simply by marking that particular event on a specific date on the calendar, such as March the 4th, 1933. The other, though, is to associate the event with something memorable that took place at the same time, whether that be the inauguration of a president, some sort of natural disaster, or some famous person's birth or death. Something that people will remember or at least will know about. Now, at one level, these two ways come to exactly the same thing. March the 4th, 1933 was, in fact, the date when Roosevelt became president. But at another, and I think far more significant level, they're not the same thing at all. Now, a date certainly does fix an event on the timeline of history. But unless you know the historical significance of that particular date and what else may have been happening at roughly that same time, simply knowing the date of something really doesn't tell you all that much. On the other hand, if you're told that something happened at the same time as some other historical event, some other important event, then that helps to place that event within the larger historical record, which is more than simply a way of remembering when something happened. It's a means of understanding that event by placing it within the bigger picture of which it's a small part, of making that one event a part of the bigger story, however small, but still a part of this bigger overarching story. Now, we have a perfect example of what I'm talking about in our Old Testament lesson this morning, which begins with the words, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lofty," and then goes on to describe the vision of the Lord that the prophet Isaiah had one day in the temple. Now, Isaiah certainly could have said, "On such and such a date in the year whatever, I saw the Lord." And while very precise in terms of locating that event within the chronological record, unless you know a great deal about Israelite history, the fact that all of this happened on that particular date wouldn't really tell you very much. On the other hand, when Isaiah said that he had had this great vision of the Lord in the year that King Uzziah died, while you may not know the exact day that happened, still you know a great deal. A great deal that's very important in our coming to an understanding of what it is that Isaiah saw, and more importantly, what it all meant. You see, King Uzziah was not just any old king. He was one of the longest reigning monarchs of Judah, having sat upon the throne for at least 40 years and perhaps as long as 50, which, if so, would have made him the longest reign in Judah's history. What is more, his reign was largely a time of peace and tranquility, famously so. One of those eras that later generations look back on as the good old days. But in the latter years of Uzziah's reign, there was trouble brewing on a distant horizon. The rise of a powerful new empire to the north, the Assyrian Empire, whose aggressive ambitions threatened to sweep away everything before it. And in fact, just a few years later, the Assyrians did destroy the northern kingdom of Israel and came very close to destroying Judah and even capturing Jerusalem, which escaped only in what the Bible calls a miracle. And it was on the eve of these tumultuous times, of these times when the whole Middle East was up in flames, that Judah's longtime and very capable King Uzziah had died. A time then of a great deal of uncertainty and growing fear. And it was then, in the midst of all that, that Isaiah saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lofty. Now, for Isaiah, the fact that God should have appeared to him at that very time, at the time when things were looking worse and worse, the very moment when the country's future seemed to be increasingly in doubt, the year when Judah had lost the only king that most people then alive had ever known, and a good king at that, all of that was no coincidence, nor some arbitrary occurrence that might just as easily have happened at some other time. That it happened when it did, in the year that King Uzziah died, was the whole point. And it is that point that Isaiah would hammer home throughout his long prophetic career. The fact that who God is how God acts. That the actions of God, unlike ours, are never arbitrary, whimsical, or capricious, but are, and always have been, and always will be, a reflection of God's very being, thus always true to who God is. It was a message of profound assurance at the very time that message was so desperately needed. Now, this idea, this conviction that who God is how God acts, is taken to its fullest and most complete expression in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, to which this day in the church year is dedicated. Now, unfortunately, and frankly, sadly, and for reasons we don't need to go into now, over the years, the doctrine of the Trinity developed in a way that makes it seem far more abstruse and mysterious than needed to be. And so, again, sadly, it has become one of those articles of faith that we know we're supposed to believe, but don't really know what to make of it, and thus really doesn't much come into play in terms of our own personal faith, which is nothing short of a tragedy. Of course, like anything else, you can make the Trinity as complex as you want to. But what lies at the heart of this doctrine is really pretty straightforward. And it can be, for all of us, a source of profound assurance. For you see, at its heart, the Trinity is simply a doctrine of who God is. That the one God exists in three personae, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the relationship among these three constitutes what the great American theologian Jonathan Edwards called a supreme harmony of all. But that supreme harmony doesn't exist in a vacuum, because it is characteristic not only of who God is, but of everything God does, all of which is grounded in that harmony and so reflects it. And that is the importance of the Trinity, because what that means is that everything about God, everything about who God is and what God does is grounded in that harmony and thus reflects it. Which means that the creation of the world, the incarnation of God's Son and his life among us, and the ultimate course of history are not things that God wakes up one morning and, for lack of anything else better to do, chooses to do that. They are all things that God does because that is who God is. Which is to say that God didn't create the world because God was bored. No, God created the world because that's who God is. And God didn't love the world because all of us are so lovable, but because that's who God is. And God is at work in the world even today, not because God needs something to do, but because that's who God is. And that is what it means for us to call God Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or to call God Creator, Redeemer, and Advocate, which is really all one and the same thing. Because again, who God is what God does. And to see the world in those terms, to understand the world in those terms, makes all the difference in the world as to how you and I live in this world. Which is why the doctrine of the Trinity is so important. Because who God is what God does.